Professor Peter Trubowitz, and dear participants, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We welcome you all to another webinar of Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement on the US foreign policy under Biden. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. After the US election 2020, when Biden secured his seat for the White House, there are lots of interest around the world on what would be the foreign policy of US during Biden administration. Similar curiosities is in South Asia and the region regarding how US is going to engage with rising China and India and other great powers in the region. To answer all these ambiguities, we have very senior scholar, Professor Peter Trubowitz, Director of the United States Centro, London School of Economics and Political Science, United Kingdom. Professor Trubowitz is a professor of international relations and director of the US Center of London School of Economics and associate fellow at Chatham House. His main teaching and research interests are in the field of international security and US foreign policy. He also writes and comments frequently on US politics. Before joining the LSE, he was professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin. He has also held visiting positions at Harvard, Princeton, University of California at San Diego, Universidad de Chile, Centro de Investigación, Docencia, Económicas, CIDE in Mexico City, and the Beijing Foreign Studies University, where he was the J. William Fulbright Distinguished Lecturer in American Foreign Policy. His publications include Politics and Strategy, Partisan Ambition and the American Statecraft, published by Princeton, and Defining the National Interest, Conflict and Change in American Foreign Policy, published by Chicago Press, as well as articles in scholarly journals such as International Security, International Studies Quarterly, and Political Science Quarterly, and many popular venues like Foreign Affairs, International Herald Tribune, and the National Interest. Professor Trubowitz, you will have around 30 to 35, maybe 40 minutes to make your initial remark, which will be followed by question and answers. We'd like to request all our participants to drop their question in the chat room of Zoom or comment on the Facebook Live. Professor Trubowitz, the floor is yours. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Pramod, and it's great to be with you and with your guest on the platform today. And I must say that it's wonderful to be back in Kathmandu, so to speak. I was there many years ago, and I know I'm going to date myself when I say this, but I traveled there when it was possible to travel overland from Istanbul to Kathmandu. Nepal was my destination, and its beauty and magnificence lived up to all my expectations and hopes in those adventurous days. So while I wish I was there in person, I'm happy to have the opportunity to take a trip down memory lane. So my charge today is to talk about Joe Biden's foreign policy. Now, these are early days, of course. The new administration is not quite a month old, and the country is still reeling from the last administration. Still, already we can see signs of an emerging Biden foreign policy. A pattern of words, actions, and policies is beginning to take shape. While they fall short of a Biden doctrine, they do cohere and they provide a basis for speculating, I think, about the shape of things to come under Joe Biden. So I'm going to begin today by describing some of the key elements or features of Biden's emerging foreign policy. I'll then spend a few minutes talking about the reasons I think Biden is moving in this general direction. And as you'll see, I think the answer has something to do with the domestic as well as international circumstances he's inherited as president. And then I'll wrap up by saying a few words about some possible risks that Biden's foreign policy approach runs in the months ahead. So every new administration comes to Washington with ideas about what it hopes to achieve in foreign policy. And the Biden administration is really no different from its predecessors in this respect. We can already see, I think, three emerging themes, which we might call Biden's 3 Rs. They include repairing America's brand, realigning America's commitments and power, and reconnecting what America does abroad to the needs of working class voters at home. Repairing, realigning, and reconnecting. I would submit those are the three dimensions or features of Biden's foreign policy that it will be worth focusing on in the weeks and months ahead. And I'm going to unpack each of these very briefly. When it comes to America's brand, Joe Biden, I think, has lost little time reasserting the nation's traditional commitment to human rights and the rule of law. And this is sure to be a constant theme in the weeks and the months ahead. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand why. 4 years of Donald Trump's indifference to human rights abroad and the flagrant abuse of the rule of law at home has taken its toll. According to a recent 13-country survey by the Pew Foundation, America's image abroad is at an all-time low. Today, just 1/3 of respondents have a favorable view of the United States. And this is noteworthy because all 13 countries are close allies of the United States. Now, this is not the first time that America's image has taken a big hit, of course. America's global standing was badly tarnished in the 2000s by America's wars in the Middle East. And before that, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, over its war in Vietnam. In each case, the president, who had to pick up the pieces, Barack Obama in the 2000s and Jimmy Carter in the 1970s, looked for ways to reposition America's brand by offering renewed hope and purpose. In Obama's case, the emphasis was placed on a return to multilateralism, to working with other countries. In Carter's case, morality was front and center. He said America, on his watch, would have a foreign policy that was as decent as the American people. Joe Biden is doing the same thing. He is seeking to repair America's damaged brand. You can see it in the individuals he's selected to fill key foreign policy positions, many like Tony Blinken and Samantha Power at the State Department, who have long championed human rights. You can see it in the White House's readouts of Biden's phone calls with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, which emphasize Biden's efforts to press the Chinese and Russian leaders on their government's human rights abuses. And you can see it too in the steps that Biden has taken to restore the US refugee program, distance Washington from Saudi Arabia, and impose sanctions on Myanmar following the coup. The point here is not that we will see perfect consistency from the Biden administration on matters having to do with human rights, or that its policies will necessarily lead Beijing, Moscow, and other capitals to buckle in the face of US pressure. Rather, it is that under Biden, human rights and the rule of law will once again be considered a strategic asset in America's diplomatic toolbox and of intrinsic value in and of themselves, marking a very sharp departure in both tone and substance from the Trump administration. Well, if presidents come to Washington with ideas about how vigorously to press liberal values and practices, they also arrive with ideas about what parts of the world are most vital to US security and how heavily to invest in alliances to protect them. In Biden's case, two things are already clear about his administration's strategic priorities. First, it intends to focus greater attention on the strategic heartland of Eurasia than its predecessor. And secondly, that it hopes to do this in close coordination with America's traditional allies in Europe and Asia, and to the extent possible, others, such as India. Much of this effort, of course, will be focused on China. And you don't have to look very far for early signs or indications of intent. One thinks of the recent announcement to create a new task force to review military policy towards China, or Biden's recent call with Modi, stressing his desire to build up the Quad, that is, its partnership with Australia, Japan, and India. The administration's announcement in the face of Chinese military activity that America's commitment to Taiwan's security is, in quotes, rock solid. The call for greater coordination with America's European allies over China on trade and investment and technology. And the decision to expand the size of the National Security Council's Indo-Pacific Directorate, making it the largest regional directorate in the administration with some 15 to 20 members. Well, the Biden administration's announcement a week ago that it will be undertaking a global force posture review to ensure that America's, as it puts it, military footprint is appropriately aligned with its foreign policy priorities. It's not only about China, but it underscores the concern inside the administration and in Congress, for that matter, that many of the Trump administration's military and economic decisions with respect to the European and Asian theaters weakened rather than strengthened the United States. Biden's decision to stop the redeployment of US forces from Germany is a case in point. So we've talked about Biden's efforts to repair America's brand. And I've said something now about his plans and efforts to realign America's commitments and power, its ends and means, with a focus principally on Eurasia and the signs that we see that it is moving in this direction. I want to now talk to the third, I think, element or dimension of Biden's foreign policy, that emerging foreign policy, that I think is going to get more attention in the weeks and months to come, which I call reconnecting to the middle class. Joe Biden won the presidency promising to build back better. While the phrase refers principally to domestic policy, it has an international dimension as well. In principle, it means that America's foreign policies need to be better aligned with the needs of average Americans, that what America does abroad needs to pay larger dividends at home. If this sounds a bit like Donald Trump's America First, well, you're not completely mistaken. I mean, while Biden's is free of the xenophobia and the racism and the unilateralism that Trump's vision entailed, what we heard repeatedly from Biden during the presidential campaign is that he was not going to pursue foreign economic policies that serve the needs of the few at the expense of the many. And so in a sense, it does echo some features of Trump's America First. Although there's nothing about Trump's America First that ultimately served the needs of the few, served the many at the expense of the few. It was very much tailored to the needs of the few. Of course, campaign talk can be cheap talk. It was in Donald Trump's case, and it could be in Joe Biden's case. But here too, I think there are signs that Biden is looking for ways to make good on the promise. There's been a lot of attention focused on his executive actions to re-enter the Paris Climate Agreement, to re-engage the World Health Organization, the WHO, and to reverse the so-called Muslim ban. But Biden has also signed an executive order strengthening Buy American provisions in federal procurement policies, and publicly ruled out signing any trade agreements, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TTIP with Europe, or an Anglo-American agreement with London, before the needs of working class Americans are met, he has said, through COVID relief, infrastructure spending, and healthcare reform. Biden has also said that he plans to reform the structure of the National Security Council led by Jake Sullivan so that the domestic benefits and the cost of foreign policy are factored into its deliberations in a more conscious or self-conscious way than has been true in the past. So these, I submit, are the core features of Biden's emerging foreign policy. Biden is trying to repair America's image in the world, refocus on America's traditional commitments in Eurasia, and reconnect what America does abroad with the needs of people at home. What unites these three elements of Biden's foreign policy is a commitment to re-engage internationally, but in ways that play to America's comparative strategic advantages, its allies, its huge economy, and its somewhat tarnished values. To understand why, we need to take stock of Biden's international and domestic circumstances. And so that's what I want to turn to now. One of the biggest myths about US foreign policy is that presidents have a free hand. Much has been written about how much more latitude presidents enjoy in foreign policy than in domestic policy. And there is some truth to this. However, every president's foreign policy choices are shaped and they're influenced in important ways by the combination of international and domestic circumstances that they face. To be sure, the circumstances facing a Harry Truman or a Ronald Reagan differed significantly from those facing Joe Biden. But the principle is the same. If you want to understand a president's foreign policy, you need to start by considering the international and domestic pressures and incentives they face. Internationally, Joe Biden has taken office at a time when there is mounting anxiety about American power. For nearly 3 decades, presidents have enjoyed a great deal of what I call geopolitical slack, or room for error internationally. The US faced a variety of challenges, such as terrorism, to be sure, but it did not face a great power rival. To growing numbers of Americans, those days appear to be numbered. And the principal concern is China. And those concerns are echoed in Congress by both Republican and Democratic lawmakers. Now, this is a far cry from the anti-Soviet consensus in the United States during the Cold War. But the emerging bipartisan consensus that China needs to be checked marks a clear departure from the prevailing view in the 2000s that as China got rich, it would become more open, more democratic, and more of a status quo power. If a more assertive China is one source of international pressure on Biden, cracks within the Western alliance are another. You know, the Trump years are going to be remembered for many things. The insurrection in Washington, the xenophobia. But one of the things it will be remembered for is declining confidence in America's word. Trump's willingness to publicly berate America's friends and question longstanding US commitments to its traditional allies has also taken a toll. While America's allies in Europe and Asia breathed a heavy sigh of relief when Biden took the oath of office on January 20th, doubts about America's reliability as a partner remain. After all, a political system that produced one Donald Trump could produce another. And this brings us to Biden's domestic circumstances. For obvious reasons, Biden will be devoting the lion's share of his time on the home front to getting the pandemic under control, to rebuilding the economy, and doing what he can to heal the nation after 4 bruising years of Donald Trump. But this is a very high hurdle, and Biden doesn't have a lot of room for error politically. While the Democrats have control over the levers of power in Congress, they have razor-thin margins to work with that they could easily lose in the 2022 midterm elections. Meanwhile, partisan division and rancor remain very high in the US. Roughly 70% of Republican voters continue to believe that the Democrats and the so-called deep state stole the election. The impeachment trial over Trump's role in the January 6th insurrection may ultimately weaken Trump and his many followers. But as of today, there's little evidence of that. There's little evidence of that right now. Biden also faces powerful constituencies within his own party, the so-called progressive wing of his party, that all things being equal would have preferred Bernie Sanders to Joe Biden. They want Biden to invest in policies and programs that will produce good jobs, better wages, more educational opportunity. and make room or inroads into dealing with the problem of climate change. And at least with respect to the first three of those, they're not alone. Many of those Democratic voters from traditional Democratic-leaning states in the industrial Midwest who crossed the line to vote for Trump in 2016 and again in 2020 want the same thing. If Biden hopes to hold on to progressives and win back many of those alienated working class voters, he needs to keep the financial and social costs of foreign policy in check and ideally pursue foreign policies that appeal to these constituencies. So all of this helps explain why Biden is reprioritizing America's traditional allies and trimming his liberal internationalist sails when it comes to trade and investment. Yet, like every president's foreign policy, Biden rests on bets. Bets about what the foreign policy will yield internationally and how sustainable it is domestically. In Biden's case, I think there are two big bets. The first is that he can regain the support of America's many allies in dealing with the international challenges that I've talked about, and especially the challenge posed by China. The second bet is that he can reconnect achievements in the international realm to recognizable benefits for average Americans. So let me say a word about each of these before concluding. Biden's plans to reprioritize America's traditional allies make sense for a number of reasons. For one thing, it's a clear and unambiguous way to signal that America is turning the page on the Trump era, and importantly, to put daylight between himself and his predecessor politically. At a time when Biden is going to be preoccupied with domestic matters, it's also a fairly cost-effective way to try to make progress on international issues that matter a great deal to most Americans, such as climate and human rights. As the recent EU-China deal makes clear, whether Biden can leverage America's alliances to put pressure on China is less certain. America's allies are no longer willing to automatically line up behind Washington, especially when it involves choosing between their commercial interests and alliance solidarity. That said, it's also clear that Europe is hardly of one mind on how to deal with China. The EU-China deal has left many on the continent unhappy with a decision that they believe puts profits before principle. And popular sentiment towards China, that is anti-China sentiment, is also surging in many European countries, especially since the start of the pandemic. But in many cases, it began before. And this creates some bargaining room for Biden. And I think this is what he and his close team believe or hope that he can capitalize on in trying to forge a coordinated approach towards China with America's allies. Biden is also betting that he can secure bipartisan buy-in for his foreign policies at home. But this too is uncertain. While a foreign policy geared to the needs of working Americans has inherent appeal, the partisan divide in the United States is now so wide on most issues that it makes it difficult to get anything passed in Congress. Indeed, Donald Trump barely tried. He simply played to his political base, content to rely on executive orders that don't require congressional approval or support to govern. Biden is also relying on executive orders, but he's also looking for ways to govern through legislative consent, if only to distinguish himself from Donald Trump, but more fundamentally, to build a lasting, durable set of policies. One of the problems with governing by executive order is what you put in place as president, the next one can overturn. And that's what Biden has spent the first few weeks doing, is overturning, among other things, overturning many of Donald Trump's executive orders. Much like Donald Trump spent his first months in office trying to overturn and overturning Barack Obama's. If you're going to try to pursue legislative consent, if you're going to try to build a broad base of support in Congress behind your policies so that they last over time, you have to find policies that are going to, in one way or another, reach across the aisle, at least on many parts of legislation. Because for institutional reasons, procedural reasons, you can't, on many policies or many legislative packages, win with a simple majority. In the area of foreign policy, Biden's most likely path to securing bipartisan support is getting tough with China. Indeed, Republicans are already pressuring him to take a hard line or a harder line, arguing that his policies are too weak or insufficiently strong and indecisive. And this is only 1 month into his administration, not even. It doesn't take too much imagination to see how Biden could play the China card to build domestic support, playing on concerns about China's growing power to win support for infrastructure and green technologies on the grounds that they would strengthen the American economy and make the US more competitive internationally. But there's a catch here, because playing on the China card or playing the China card for domestic political purposes is not risk-free. For one thing, it is sure to fuel anti-American sentiment in China, which would likely complicate efforts to work with Beijing on important issues such as climate change and nuclear proliferation. Playing the China card could also complicate Biden's efforts to develop a coordinated approach with America's allies towards Beijing. While many of America's friends are anxious about China's intentions, they're not spoiling for a fight with Beijing. So while Biden's emerging foreign policy represents a welcome departure from Trump's in important respects, it's not without its own risks, and its success is hardly guaranteed. And on that cautious note, I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much, Professor Trubowitz. Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture and very comprehensive one. We really learned a lot, and I'm sure our participants, as you mentioned, benefited from it. We have already received around 27 questions from the participants. So without wasting any time, let me move to the question and answer sessions. The first question is, do you think US foreign policy would be different under Joe Biden compared to the previous Democrat presidents?
This is a very good question. And I think the answer is yes. Yes and no, I should say. No, in the sense, let me start with, it will be similar in the following ways. There will be greater reliance on international institutions than we saw under Donald Trump, and more similar to what we saw under Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. There will be, I think, greater efforts to balance what we might call the military and the diplomatic portfolios, so that there'll be like there was under Obama and under Bill Clinton, greater emphasis on diplomacy than we saw, let's say, under Donald Trump. I think one area where you can expect greater separation from the Clinton administration and the Obama administration is over foreign economic policy. So both of those administrations were very quick to pursue, or maybe not quick, but both of them pursued what we might call a liberal internationalist trade agenda, not all that different from Republicans in that they favored liberalized trade and liberalized trade agreements and efforts to open markets to American corporations. And this was very clear under Bill Clinton with PNTR and the opening to China and China's ascension to the WTO, and also under Barack Obama through its policies, through the Trans-Pacific Partnership and its efforts to get the United States into that and a broad agreement, and on the other side of the Eurasian landmass through the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership with America's traditional European allies. And I think what we're already hearing, as I suggested, from Biden is he's not going to be pursuing any big trade packages, certainly at the start of his administration. And that what I think we're going to see more from him is an attempt to try to, if he moves in the area of trade, to tailor it more to working class needs by looking for ways to simultaneously create or build non-tradable jobs. And that's why I emphasized like infrastructure spending, because that's a way to do it. You could also do it through climate change legislation. But I think that we're going to see more of an emphasis on that side. And I think we would have seen that no matter which one of the Democrats won the nomination and if they became president. But I think Biden has made this very clear. So that's one, I think there are other things to point to, but that's one very important one.
So we have another question on Quadrilateral Security Alliance, like how committed will Biden be on the issue of Quad and the Indo-Pacific strategy?
I think that Biden will want to move the needle, as we say, on that, to push things. He's already made that very clear in his conversation, his first phone call with Modi. But if you look at the US, the White House's readout of that call and Delhi's readout of that call, you'll get a different view on how important the Quad actually is. So, the White House has kind of stressed that that was part of the conversation, and Delhi has not. It is interested in, closer ties in the Indo-Pacific and using that terminology and so forth. But I think that, this is something Biden is going to have to work to get the support of India on. I think it will be less difficult to get Japan's support and Australia's support. But I think in general, what I think we can expect the administration to do is to try to solidify ties with allies and potential allies or partners, strategic ties in the region, to put additional pressure on China without turning China into some kind of implacable enemy or foe. They're going to want to try to have it both ways, the administration, and that's threading a needle. That can be difficult. But I think, what I would expect is, and we can already see they pushed very hard to pursue the exercises, the joint exercises with India, to accelerate those. So were put on hold back in, I think it was October or maybe September, back in the fall, and those are now back on. And I think we can expect more emphasis on those kinds of, on that partnership going forward.
So you just mentioned about China, and there are lots of questions, maybe around 8 or 9 questions on China. Like, how is Biden going to deal with rising and assertive China? What will be Biden's policy towards serious human rights violation in Xinjiang?
So Biden has two, I think, objectives vis-a-vis China. One is for, and he has campaigned on this, is to lay down some markers and take a tougher stand with respect to China kind of throwing its weight around in its neighborhood. And it's already made this, as I mentioned, very clear with respect to Taiwan. But I think the concern is not only Taiwan. And I think the feeling is, is that while Donald Trump was arguably tough on trade, he was less tough on other issues, other strategic issues, and gave China kind of more running room, and especially on human rights. It was not until very late in the Trump administration that they began to, push back against Beijing on Xinjiang and also on Hong Kong. Now, and what I would expect from Biden is more of an effort to take advantage of America's alliances to adopt a more coordinated approach on questions like trade and investment, but also on human rights, recognizing that that is an area where you can get common agreement, at least among many Western countries. I'm not saying all, and maybe not on every issue, but this is an issue already, Xinjiang, that, Biden is pushing. And I won't be surprised to see him push his America's allies in Europe on this question and on Hong Kong.
Thank you, sir. Then another question on, like you said in your remark that Biden will spend lots of time at home to deal with pandemic, economic growth, and divided society. In this situation, how can US focus to contain China? Are we witnessing the beginning of the end of American era?
Well, those are kind of two questions. These are good questions wrapped together. The domestic constraints, the things that I talked about, the pandemic, building back the economy, partisan polarization, do impose constraints on Biden with respect to China and many other things in the foreign policy realm. And that's why I think, as I was saying, He's going to be looking for ways to combine what he wants to do internationally with what he wants to do domestically. So let me give you an example. There's a bill before Congress right now. It's called the Schumer-Mendez bill. It calls for $350 billion in infrastructure spending and industrial policy spending to make the United States more competitive to deal with, in quotes, the clear and present danger posed by China. It is a policy that is focused domestically, but the argument is being made that the United States has to invest domestically so that it is better positioned to compete and push back against China internationally. So this is the kind of way that the United States, that the Biden administration may very well try to connect what it's doing internationally with what it hopes to achieve domestically and to build support around this. There are Republicans who will support that kind of a policy. The danger is that you can get a lot of very intense rhetoric surrounding it, and you can polarize the existing US-China relationship to a point at which America's allies in the region begin to get skittish about being too closely associated with US policy, because most of America's allies still want commercial relations with China. China's their biggest market, in many cases, not the United States. So they don't want to sacrifice that. On the other hand, they want security protection, and they're concerned about China's intentions. So Biden is going to be trying, I think he's going to be led by the incentive structure, domestic and international, to look for policies that allow him to address both the international and domestic concerns at the same time. What I'm suggesting is that there are risks associated with that, but nevertheless, that's probably the direction he will be pulled.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, like Trump initiated dialogue with North Korea. There was UAE-Israel peace deal. Do you see continuation of such initiative by Biden? If Biden is going to continue them, then what is new that Biden will initiate to make his foreign policy distinct from Trump's?
I think one of the things that Biden will not do is completely reverse everything that Donald Trump has done. If only to have bargaining leverage in dealing with other countries. So he has, for example, already announced that he's not going to remove the tariffs on China. And he hasn't immediately removed the tariffs on America's allies in Europe. So my guess is that he will use those to bargain for concessions, that if he trades, that he will trade them away for other things he wants. And I think the same goes true I don't think he's going to reverse what has been done with respect to the agreements that Trump signed in the Middle East. What he may try to do is find ways to combine those. This is the challenge for him, with his stated desire to renegotiate the treaty or somehow get back into a treaty with Iran over nuclear proliferation. But I don't think that Biden will simply revoke those treaties. Having said that, we've already seen him push back against Saudi Arabia in a way that Donald Trump would never have done and didn't do. In the case of North Korea, this is a complicated one. What I don't think we will see is Joe Biden sending love letters to the dear leader in North Korea. What we may see is some effort, perhaps through a third party or multi-party talks, to try to get North Korea back to the table. A very tough nut to crack. And let me also just use this as an opportunity to say as well that Joe Biden has an agenda, but so do other foreign leaders. And North Korea could very quickly complicate Joe Biden's calculus through the firing off of ballistic missiles and so forth. So, I mean, other countries have, cards that they can play as well. And, in international and world politics, as most of you know on this platform, events can suddenly change your foreign policy agenda because you've got a crisis or an emergency to deal with.
So we have another question from our friend from Africa. US foreign policy towards developing countries, especially Africa, has been described brutal since the fall of Berlin Wall. China has become a key economic and infrastructure partner with increasingly divided international structure caused by US-China geopolitical context. So in this context, the question is how Biden expects to restore US image in developing countries?
First, by focusing more attention on them than the Trump administration did. Secondly, I think trying to work more with America's traditional allies in a more kind of coordinated position on especially in the area of aid. And I think some of Biden's, there's a saying that personnel is policy. And I think some of Biden's early appointments, like Samantha Power in USAID, are meant to signal despite limited resources, given the concerns that exist at home in the United States right now, that the administration will be trying to invest more time, energy, and resources in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, and in other developing parts of the globe. Having said that, I don't think it's going to be the principal focus of this administration. This is just it's a guess. I feel like it's an educated guess, and it's based on a lot on kind of what we're seeing. But I think the Eurasia landmass is going to be the principal focus. And in particular, what is happening in the Asian theater and and in the European theater. I think, and in effect, what I'm saying is that I think if it's possible, the Biden administration would like to focus less attention on the Middle East. But the Middle East has a way of claiming president's attention. And so, this is kind of, you can want it and you can desire it and not achieve it.
So the next question is South Asia. How is US going to engage with South Asia in general and India in particular?
Well, I think so I think a couple things here. I think in general, this administration is going to focus more attention on nuclear proliferation and its desire to, its efforts to kind of global efforts to support both non-proliferation or arms control, which is relevant, obviously, in the South Asia context. I do think that it will focus as well attention on, terrorism and trying to deal with international terrorism, though frankly, it has a domestic problem with terrorism that is going to take priority. But I think thirdly, just to go back to the point that the question that was raised earlier, I think in particular, India is going to be a focus in this desire to develop and expand America's strategic partnerships, it's not going to get an alliance with India, but with a partnership perhaps with India to deal with common concerns, freedom of navigation, for example, given, and so that those are areas where I think you can expect the administration to try to invest more of its time and its energy and its resources.
Professor, as you are aware that there is a military coup in Myanmar. So what will be Biden's policy towards the military coup in Myanmar or Burma in the context that China may strategically get closer to them and benefit from it?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think we can see here right now already that the Biden administration has limited cards to play. So it's played right away the card that it can play, which is sanctions, and kind of a warning, towards Beijing, but it has limited room to maneuver here, and that is just the reality. That doesn't mean that it shouldn't take the position that it's taken on human rights. If it doesn't push immediately on human rights and the rule of law, both at home, it has to do that at home now, given what happened in the United States, but also internationally. It is sacrificing a strategic asset, it's giving it up, and there's no reason to give it up. It's much better to put, for the US, to put pressure, much of it rhetorical, but in the court of international public opinion, on Beijing's back, on Russia's back, on Saudi Arabia's back. And I think, frankly, there are a lot of people around the world that are looking for the United States to do that, and to do it both with some humility in light of what's happened inside the United States. So recognizing the United States is not on some kind of white horse, it's got its own internal problems that really need to be addressed. But addressing those can also help signal internationally that the US is truly committed to the rule of law and to dealing and guaranteeing the right of assembly, free speech, and human rights.
Professor, we still have around 22 questions, but this will be the last question for today. What will be the future of liberal hegemonic world order under Biden?
Well, the phrasing is I know that you've had John Mearsheimer on this platform, and that sounds like John's terminology. So let me just rephrase it. What will the future of the liberal international order be? It's a great question, and I'm working on a book precisely on this question with a colleague at the University of Amsterdam. His name is Brian Burgoon. And what it shows is that the erosion of support, not only in the United States, but across OECD countries for the liberal international order, has been a secular trend that has been happening or occurring for some time. It didn't start with Donald Trump. It didn't start with Brexit. It has deep roots. And one of the ways that the West has to begin, countries like the United States, have to begin to address it, is that they need to make sure that what they do internationally and the policies they pursue, whether it's global governance or multilateral cooperation or liberal trade, is paying dividends domestically at home. That's what's broken in many OECD countries right now. And that's why you're seeing the surge of nationalism and populism. Not the only reason, but an important one. And until countries like the United States repair that, they're going to have trouble internationally.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your time and in-depth and interesting discussion. I, on behalf of NICE and our participants, would like to thank you for your valuable time. We hope to see you in real in Kathmandu or maybe any other parts of the world. We'd also like to thank you and thank our participant for the wonderful question. Professor Peter, have a nice day and good night to our friends in Asia.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to be with you, and thanks for those wonderful questions. Great group of people on the platform. It's been my great pleasure to be with you.